Hello, this is Writers at Work, a podcast for readers and writers about the joys, heartaches, challenges, and satisfaction of the creative writing process. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. My guest on this episode of Writers at Work is Elijah Wald, veteran music journalist, cultural critic, and well-traveled blues and folk guitarist. That last attribute is meaningful. If Elijah brings a been there, done that feel when writing about the likes of Robert Johnson, Josh White, Dave Van Ronk, Woody Guthrie, Pete Seeger, and Bob Dylan, it's because he's been there and done that. Accordingly, mythology can't fool him, and he knows the story lies in the facts. Elijah's bio is fascinating, and I encourage you to seek out what you can find out about him. Though his latest book is Jelly Roll Blues, Censored Songs and Hidden Histories, a typically rich Wald foray into a world of music, we're going to spend our time together discussing his 2015 book, Dylan Goes Electric, Newport, Seeger, Dylan, and the Night That Split the 60s. It's the basis for the new film, A Complete Unknown, James Mangold's biodrama of Bob Dylan, his arrival in Greenwich Village, his growth as an artist, and his controversial set at the 1965 Newport Folk Festival. Even if, or especially if, you've seen the film, and I think everyone I know has, you will learn from Elijah that there is much more to the story than can be conveyed in a 141-minute film. To say Elijah explains it all might be overstating it, but not by much. Elijah Wald, welcome to Writers at Work.
Thanks for having me.
Elijah, I want to sort out the chronology a little bit here. The Coen Brothers' Inside Llewyn Davis is somewhat inspired by Dave Van Ronk's memoir, The Mayor of McDougal Street. And as I understand it, you helped write that book. Is that correct?
I pretty much wrote that book. Dave and I were shopping it for years and years, trying to get a contract that would pay enough so he could take a year off and just work on that. And we never got that kind of offer. And eventually, he died. And he had written a few bits and pieces, but I basically didn't want to let it go. So at that point, I assembled every interview I could find with him. And I had spent an awful lot of time sitting in front of that man, listening to him talk, and had that voice in my head. And it was sort of my way of coming to terms with the fact that he was gone, was to just take, I don't remember how many months, and just sit with his voice and write that book in his voice.
How did you get to know him?
I actually through a mutual friend when I was probably, 13 or 14. But then I went to New York when I was 17 and took guitar lessons from him for a year.
Ah,
And during that period, rather quickly, he shifted me to the end of the day, and we'd do my lesson, and then he'd cook dinner, and we'd eat dinner, and we'd crack open a bottle of Jameson's. And just before 11, when the liquor store closed, he'd send me out for a second bottle of Jameson's. And I would stumble home sometime around dawn. And then for years after that, if I was in New York, I was sleeping on his couch. I mean, it was a long relationship. And honestly, that's the book of mine people associate with Dave Van Ronk, but virtually everything I've ever written could not have been written without what I learned from Dave Van Ronk.
amazing. Amazing. You know, you mentioned your age when you went to the village. Um, if somebody had told me you were 95 years old, I would have believed it. Because
I'm 65 years old.
right, but you always seem to put us in a contemporary frame of mind in your writing.
Well, I was lucky. My father was 52 years old when I was born. My father was born in 1906. So I grew up with someone who was singing all these songs and talking about his youth, who was 5 years older than Robert Johnson. So, I had a very direct connection to that world. And then when I was, I don't know, probably 8 or 9 years old, I had this little record player up in my room, and my grandparents had all these old 78 albums of the Almanac Singers and Paul Robeson and Josh White basically the Jewish communist record collection of the 1940s.
Right.
And since no one was listening to 78s anymore, the grown-ups all had LPs. Those were my records. So weirdly enough, I grew up on the same records that the people in the 60s had grown up on.
And were you a voracious reader when you were a kid? Did you love
Yeah,
to read? And so
absolutely.
so the
I mean,
the
I have this distinct memory of being in the library in Woods Hole where we spent the summers and worrying that there weren't enough books there to last me. That by the time I was a grown up, I'd have read everything, and then what would I do?
oh my goodness.
It was not a reasonable worry.
And when did you kind of conclude that your two worlds could in fact be one world of music and writing?
That happened completely by accident. I mean, I'd always, I'd worked at my writing, but with the dream of writing the great American novel, for which I had no talent whatsoever. But I did teach myself to touch type when I was a teenager, which came in useful. But so, I occasionally kept a journal and I would write extremely pretentious and very short pieces, but really was just planning to be a musician. And then by pure chance, I was invited to write a record review for the Boston Globe, and they liked it and paid me, and I started doing more of that. And over the years, it reached the point where I was making a good living as a freelance writer for the Globe and a few other places, and it was paying a lot better than the music. That was never a plan. It just worked out that way.
Do you think that being a musician made you a better music journalist?
No, being a musician certainly made me better at writing about music, or I don't even know whether I want to say better, but it gave me a different approach to writing about music than a lot of people who approach it from other directions. No, honestly, what happened was when I started writing regularly for the Globe, Dave Van Ronk said, okay, if this is what you're going to do, you need to read all these people, and handed me A.J. Liebling and Calvin Trillin and Joseph Mitchell. And, basically just said, if you're going to do this, study these people. And I did, and they still are the people who Joseph Mitchell, actually, he didn't give me and isn't one of mine, but Liebling was his hero, and he also pushed Mencken on me, which didn't do as well for me. But Liebling is it as far as I'm concerned.
You and I are about the same age, and it's funny because our models had came from people who were writing criticism of other art forms. There weren't a whole lot of rock and pop uh, journalists that we could follow as models.
Well,
I mean, who were the people writing about the kind of music you came to love?
Sam Charters. I mean, definitely Sam Charters. As a writer, not just as I mean, a lot. There were a lot of people who educated me. Paul Oliver. There are any number of people, but Sam Charters also was a really fine writer. But I have to say, I'm not a critic. I mean, I did some criticism early on, but I got out of that as quick as I possibly could to doing profiles when I was a journalist and, interviews and profiles.
Sure.
And as a writer, I have I've pretty much just been a historian. Um, because I feel like there's way too little music history that's been written. Virtually everything that masquerades as music history is music criticism. And I wanted to take a different approach.
Mm. I just want to go back to Inside Llewyn Davis for a minute, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Were you consulted at all?
No,
And what did you?
nobody wants the writer around. I mean, they invited me to come visit the set, and I spent a very pleasant afternoon sitting with the Coen brothers while they were editing. I mean, they were very generous. I actually sent them an audition tape. I wanted to be in the movie. That one, I was a fan of the Coen brothers, so
Yeah,
that was fun.
yeah.
Um,
I spent a little time with them before the movie came out. And I remember that Ethan was very passionate about having firsthand knowledge of the scene. That
Yeah, I mean, he talked to a bunch of people who were closer to it than I was, honestly. And I'm really glad they used that book as an inspiration.
you know, did the
But
did the
it was really their New York story. I mean, that was for the Coens. The whole thing was they'd lived in New York since they were teenagers and never done a New York movie.
yeah, did
And
the
Van Ronk would have loved that about that because I mean,
okay.
Van Ronk's plan for that book was very different than what it ended up. He wanted to write a book about Greenwich Village in the 50s. And because he died, I was stuck making it much more about the folk scene than he had wanted it to be, because that's what people had interviewed him about. I
Right.
mean, he wanted to write much more about I mean, there's one chapter in that book about a couple of guys who are absinthe smugglers that has no mention of music. That's the only full chapter he wrote himself. Those are the
Oh,
sorts of stories he wanted to tell. His
wow.
his model was Mencken's Days books, and that he wanted to do that kind of book.
So the film Inside Llewyn Davis comes out in 2013. Had you started working on Dylan at Newport at that point?
Uh no. Oh, wait a minute. 2013. No. No, the Dylan Goes Electric. That book happened very fast.
Ah,
That book, honestly, I pitched that one for the money. Most of my books start as labors of love, and and the way they pay, they remain labors of love. That one, I had written a book that is a history of American popular music from 1890 to 1970, but for a catchy title, I called it How the Beatles Destroyed Rock and Roll.
right,
And when we got to, I guess, January, February, I forget, January 2014, the anniversary of them hitting the US with the Ed Sullivan Show.
right.
A couple of reporters who had run out of other angles called me up trying to get the anti-Beatles angle. And it hit me that, 50th anniversaries were a big deal. The 50th anniversary of Dylan Going Electric was coming up. And if I could rush out a book, I could own that moment. And
Wow.
I called my agent and said, could you sell this? And she said, hell yes. And so I wrote up a pitch and she sold it. And I had thought, this is a story that's been told so many times that I could just, read the Dylan books and pull something together and get it out there and make some decent bread and it would all be easy. But once I started looking at it, it all looked completely different. And it actually turned into the most intense um, job I've ever had in my life. I did the whole thing, research and writing, in 6 months, but
Oh my God.
it was really all day, every day, and my wife chipping in so that I would make, put post-its in books, and she would type out the bits I'd underlined. I mean, I never asked her to help me on a book before or since, but that one, we sort of sat down together and said, this could pay for 2 years of our life. If it works out, let's step up and do it together. And she was terrifically helpful. And honestly, I think the book's better because it happened so fast. I think it moves much more. I think it moves quickly because it was happening quickly.
But it has no sense of the slapdash to it. It's
Well,
very
no, I try to be a professional,
no
and
beyond.
the thing that happened, the breakthrough with that book, the original pitch that I had, I was going to do, the first half was going to be the story of the folk scene leading up, and then the second half would be Dylan arrives. And the breakthrough was realizing I don't have to do an expansive history of the folk scene because Pete Seeger can represent all of that.
Well,
And
what
making it a story of Seeger and Dylan And that's why I now have a movie to my amazement. I mean,
Right.
let me just say, I feel like I've won the lottery twice. I mean, this is crazy. I don't write the kind of books that typically get turned into Hollywood movies.
Well, what I meant by not slapdash is that um, the, there's a beautiful logical flow to the storytelling, and it's exactly what you just said. It's not here's folk music over here and here's Bob over there. It's woven together so beautifully. Um,
Thank you.
I must. When you start reading it, um, there's no point where you say, I think I'll skip ahead here because I know this already. No, there's everything is there's causality all over the place in that book. Anyway, I love that book. So
Well, I
so
mean, let's also say, I couldn't have written that book in 6 months if I hadn't lived my entire life in that world. I mean, I'd been playing this music since I was a kid. I lived with Van Ronk. I knew, I had all the phone numbers I wanted. I was very, very, very familiar with the world I was writing about, the
right,
politics. I mean, I grew up, when I was 6, 7 years old, I was going to Vietnam War rallies. I mean, it was very much my world.
yeah, and then Pete Seeger dies in 2014. Are you writing at that point?
Um, Gee, if you tell me what month, I could maybe answer
Okay,
that. But it
yeah,
was right around. I mean, he was not someone I could talk to for the project, obviously. I had interviewed Pete when I did my book on Josh White, and I had had dinner with him when we were both at something else. And he also, he and my father were not close friends, but I mean, he was in our living room in 1975. I remember an evening with Pete and my dad sitting around. As I say, this was my world.
yeah. Did the so you never talked about the 65 folk festival with him?
No, I mean, and if I had, I would have got the version that he was telling by the 1980s, which is very, very different from
Right.
the version he was telling at the time or even a year or two after that. I mean, I didn't try to talk to Pete. I mean, I wouldn't have tried to talk to Pete about that. I didn't try to talk to Dylan. Anybody who has been being interviewed for 50 years about something, there's no point interviewing them.
Right. Right. I found Seeger. I found a different Pete Seeger in your book than I've ever come across. Um, a-
Yeah, well, I was trying to do that.
and I have great sympathy for him.
Yeah,
Uh,
no, I
it,
mean, my dream with that book was that by the time Dylan goes electric at the Newport Folk Festival, I wanted readers not to know whether they would have cheered or booed. I felt like everybody would go into that book knowing what they thought, and I wanted them to reach that moment less sure about what they thought.
right.
Because
Right.
that's what makes it interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, otherwise, there's no mystery there. There's no, you're not building to anything. The only way to make it build to something was to make people feel more confused.
Yeah. I mean, the book could have been about what was lost.
Well, it was. I mean, the book was about both. That
Yeah.
that's that was the aim, was to make you understand that something's lost and something's gained in living every day, like the song lyric says.
Right. Right. Um,
I mean, let me also say that, that had been my aim in How the Beatles Destroyed Rock and Roll. I mean, that's what that title was about, was that people write the stories of revolutions depending on, they write it typically from a point of view in which either the revolution was horrific or was wonderful. But
right.
every revolution has, it's horrific for some people and wonderful for others. And the Beatles book, I was trying to write a history of popular music that made people understand that, with every major change, all this valuable stuff gets lost as well as all this valuable stuff shows up. So yeah, I went into the Dylan book with that mindset already very much in my
Right.
mind.
Right. When people talk about Jackie Robinson, they don't position the story as the death of the Negro Leagues.
Good example. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, you can tell the whole story of integration that way. I mean, by now there are a lot of people who have noticed that it simply destroyed Black communities while at the same time making all sorts of things possible for Black individuals. I mean, it's not one way or the other. You know, the world, yeah,
Yeah.
I don't
And,
need to.
and no, no, and I must say that's one of the, I would advise, and I think I have in the introduction, they should give your book to people when they walk out of the theater, because it really is, whatever the opposite of crib notes are, is your book, because it,
Um, yeah, I mean, there are several books. You know, there's my book, obviously, Susie Rotolo's memoir, Dylan's Chronicles. I mean, there are a bunch of good books.
you know, I want to talk about when you were 2 years old when Bob arrived in the village. So for you, as it is with me, there was always a Bob Dylan. At at what point in
Actually, oddly enough, not because I was never a radio listener and I was completely out of touch. Despite being that age, must be one of the last people on earth who was completely devoted to Woody Guthrie before I heard Bob Dylan.
wow. And
And
what
in
did you
fact, I remember distinctly my father brought home Bob Dylan's greatest hits, put it on. I don't remember whether it's the first track, but very early is Rainy Day Women. And I was like, this guy's a terrible singer. And my father was, well, I mean, you like Woody Guthrie, and he sounds like Woody Guthrie. And I said, he sounds nothing like Woody Guthrie. Um, I mean, obviously, I've revised some of that opinion, but the fact is, he doesn't sound like Woody Guthrie. But in any case, no, I mean, I was already singing Woody Guthrie songs before I had any idea of who Bob Dylan was.
that's fascinating. Do you consider yourself a fan?
Um, well, depends what period we're talking about. I mean, I
Okay.
think Highway 61 is one of the greatest records ever made. I love the I like the first album a lot. I like a lot of Freewheelin'. Like Bring It All Back Home is brilliant. By the time you get to Blonde on Blonde, I love the sound of the band, but the singing, the kind of voice, I'm less excited about. And I like some of the later records. But really my Dylan is up through Highway 61. And I had never thought I would write about Dylan because that is such an unfashionable position. And then I suddenly realized that here was a book project I could do that would end in 65 and that would work that way.
Yeah, it more or less
And
corresponds to
yeah. And in
your
that
favorite
world,
period.
I'm a huge fan. I
Right.
mean, I've been, in fact, trying to persuade the Dylan people to let me edit a Dylan blues album with the unissued freewheeling sessions and some of the live stuff. I mean, my world is coming out of the intersection of pre-war blues and all the other kinds of music I like. And that's exactly where Dylan is in that
Right.
early period.
One of the things that is so effective in your book is, I think people watching the movie might think, okay, he makes this debut album that doesn't sell very well, and then here's freewheeling Bob Dylan, and wow, where did that come from? And in your book, you point out that I think you said he recorded 20 tracks in the between those two albums.
Yeah, there's a missing Bob Dylan album.
Right.
I mean, that's why I've been I actually wrote a piece for the Oxford American that you can easily find online if you search me. It probably just got harder, actually. You used to be able to just search Elijah Wald, Bob Dylan, and you found that article. Now you probably have to add Oxford American, which is basically my piece on the Dylan album that didn't come out. Basically, he was recording a follow-up to the first album that would have been a fairly solid blues album with I forget, maybe a quarter of it with an electric band, maybe a little less. And then he signed with Albert Grossman, and Albert Grossman hooked up Peter, Paul, and Mary with Blowing in the Wind. And they shelved the blues album, and Bob Dylan became a singer-songwriter.
Yeah, in your book, you make some really vivid descriptions of the pre-Greenwich Village Bob Dylan. For example, you point out how he listened to black music coming out of Louisiana on a pirate radio station, and that he had a lot of streams of music flowing through him, even before he considered folk as a communications vehicle. You also point out that when he was a kid on stage, he was a maniac.
Well,
That
I mean, one of the things that was fun about this project is that pretty much without exception, and maybe even completely without exception, all Dylan books had been the story of the songwriter. And I was writing a book about this guy who decides to go electric and blow everybody, blow everybody's eardrums by playing loud blues. And that was not a poetic decision. So I'm writing the story of how this young rock and roller goes into playing acoustic music for a while, though he's still heavily into blues, and then makes this decision to go back to playing loud electric music and basically ignoring who he is as a poet and just talking about who he is as a musician and performer, which is not. I don't think there's another book that had looked at him specifically as a musician and performer rather than as a songwriter. So
Now
that was fun.
you point out, for example, that most of us are used to hearing Bob playing the harmonica through the rack, and you point out that when he was just playing the harmonica cupped in his hands, that he was a far superior harmonica player than we realize.
And a very, very different one. I mean, as a rack player, he mostly played straight harp, which means that if you're playing a C harp, you're playing in the key of C.
Right.
As an accompanist, he almost always played cross harp, that is C harp in G. He could do a pretty good Sonny Terry imitation. Yeah, no, I mean, he was a very, very good musician, always. And not, I don't need to put that in the past tense, is a very good musician always. And I think there's been a lot of misunderstanding of the extent to which Dylan is a songwriter in order to create something for himself to perform. I mean, I think he has always thought of the writing as providing the performer with material.
Right. Right. Can we talk a little bit about the concept of authenticity?
Sure.
Uh, um, as you explained, the folk music presented at Newport was largely part of a folk revival that had a decidedly commercial veneer. Um, I wonder how many people think that the Kingston Trio were real folk musicians.
Well, huh. So let me start this one backwards. Years ago, I happened into Dave Van Ronk's apartment when he had got a freelance writing gig where he was reviewing videos, music video tapes. And he had been handed a tape of the Kingston Trio and Limelighters doing a dual reunion concert, which I am sure had been handed to Dave Van Ronk with the idea that he would be slashing and funny about it. And he instead wrote this review saying, um, they were in a way much more authentic than we were. We were pretending to be Southern sharecroppers and guys from the Mississippi Delta, whereas they got on stage as middle class college guys, which is what we all were. Dave actually wasn't, but he was making a point.
Right.
Um, and so, in a way, they were more authentic on stage, presenting who they really were than Dave or the New Lost City Ramblers. Um,
Yeah, there
the
were,
authenticity, when people want to have the conversation about authenticity, my question is always authentically what?
right.
Because nothing is authentic unto itself. It's an authentic example of something. And, an authentic Louisiana Cajun musician is someone who is authentically from Louisiana and authentically Cajun and plays music from that culture. Um, and that's a real thing. There will be, if I want to interview, there are people who will say sentences like, well, to me, John Hammond is just as authentic a Delta blues player as whoever you want to mention, who is in fact black and from the Delta.
Right.
Um, and if what they mean is he plays that music in a way that sounds just as much what they think of that sound as being, yeah, that's right. But if what they mean is if you want to do an interview with him and find out what it's like to grow up as a black blues player in Mississippi, no, he's not. It depends uh, what you what you're looking for is the first question. And after you've answered that question, you can decide whether what you're seeing is an authentic example of that.
What I'm taking from our conversation is that because of the music you had um, access to as a young child, uh, freed you from mythology of later claims by people who were trying to get across the idea that they were the thing that you had been listening to as a child. Yes? No?
I'm not sure I understood that.
Yeah. No, I don't think that was phrased very well. um, you're listening to the real thing, and then 25 years later, somebody tells you that somebody who's not the real thing is the real thing.
Um,
And you,
y-
as the writer,
no, I see no, it's more complicated than that. I mean, I was listening to the Almanac Singers.
right,
I was not listening to the Almanac Singers and going, Woody Guthrie's real, Pete Seeger's a middle class city boy pretending to be that. Um, I don't think there was ever a moment when until I just said that sentence right this minute, I don't think I ever would have said that sentence, and it isn't like I agree with it. Um, Woody Guthrie was a creation too. I mean, Woody Guthrie was a guy who was reading Darwin and Freud and then getting on stage and talking like and pretending to be Will Rogers. Um, everybody creates a persona, every performer. I mean, we're
right,
talking about
right,
professional performers here.
right.
And Woody Guthrie invented a persona just as much as Pete Seeger did. So I'm not going to go real and not real.
Yeah, yeah, I get what you're saying.
But they're different.
But I mean, can you become the thing that you are pretending or wanting to be?
Depends what the thing is.
I
Let's
mean,
take the example of Ramblin' Jack Elliott, who
okay,
decides to be a cowboy. Well, virtually all the cowboys in the actual heyday of cowboydom were young guys who went west rather from the east because they wanted to be cowboys.
right.
There is nothing more authentically cowboy than running out to the west because you want to assume a new identity. This is it. There aren't easy answers to this stuff, and for a lot of things, I think it's irrelevant. I mean, Ramblin' Jack Elliott is as authentically the thing you see on stage as anybody on the planet. I mean, boy, is that man sui generis. I mean, there is only one Ramblin' Jack Elliott, and he's it.
Right.
Um, there are, you know, let me put it this way. There are a lot of people by now, not only white, though, white is still the majority, who, if you talk to them, they sound like me or you. And then they get on stage and sing blues and they sound like a guy from Mississippi.
Right.
That to me is essentially inauthentic. And I have spent the last 20 years trying to figure out how to sing in my own voice just because it feels more comfortable to me. And it's like, the whole idea of blues is you're supposed to express yourself. If you have to put on someone else's voice to do that, that's a little weird. Um, but like Ramblin' Jack Elliott, the person you hear on records is exactly the same person you're sitting in a room with. He's very authentically himself. And Van Ronk, that was true of as well. Van Ronk didn't change his voice when he sang. Um, so, I don't have an easy answer, but that's how I think about it.
Yeah. Can at what point did did it become clear to you that this movie was actually going to get made?
Oh, I didn't. I had my doubts until the cameras started rolling. I mean, you never, anybody who has had their books optioned has learned the lesson that you very rarely, after you get a book option, does anything actually happen. And when this one originally got optioned, I assumed it was going to be some kind of documentary. The idea that it was going to be, one of the big Hollywood movies of the year, I would never have imagined. This one was a little bit weird because the Dylan book, Dylan Goes Electric, the people who optioned it was Dylan's office.
So
And
that
I must admit my first reaction is, why do you need my book? You have Dylan.
right.
The answer seems to be that Dylan liked the book, which
Ah,
is wild. I mean, that I could not have imagined.
so you talked to somebody like Jeff Rosen, and
Yeah,
that parenthetically, folks, Jeff is Bob's manager. Um, oh, that is interesting because so were you consulted along the way?
no, 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 no. As I say, nobody wants, particularly this movie, nobody wants someone who's going to be sitting there saying, no, that's not the way it happened. That's an impediment to good storytelling.
So
I wouldn't have wanted me around.
you've been at it long enough to let go. Once you let go, you let go.
It's more than that. I mean, I've been around long enough to know how lucky I am if I write what I think is a good a good Bob Dylan book out of hundreds of Bob Dylan books, and mine happens to be the one that's picked for a major Hollywood movie. I'm lucky.
Yeah,
I mean, and when Llewyn Davis came out, Dave by that time was dead. But like I've conveyed, I think several times in this interview, Dave kind of raised me. He was kind of
yeah,
a second
yeah,
father to me.
yeah.
And, people would ask me, what do you think Dave would have thought of the movie? And I know this is going to sound cynical, but this is speaking as someone who was very close to Dave Van Ronk. My response was Dave would think the check cleared.
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, if it's a good movie, that's, as they say in Louisiana, lagna.
Right.
But, the important thing is you've just got this incredible windfall, which allows you to sit down and write other things that aren't going to give you that kind of windfall.
Right. Right. So what did you think of the movie when you saw it?
Oh, I like it. I mean, you know, for me, and this was true also of Llewyn Davis, um, everything else is secondary to how well they treat the music. And both of those films, I thought, were intensely respectful of the music, not in the sense of embalming it, but in the sense of believing that it was genuinely exciting and that an audience would be genuinely captivated by completely straightforward performances of music that I love. And I see very little, the number of times in a Hollywood movie that you see somebody just playing an acoustic guitar and singing one of the songs I grew up with. And the filmmakers treat that as if it's interesting enough that you can go through verse after verse of the song. Um, and they just feel like that's interesting in itself. That never happens. So both of the movies, for me, that's the starting point. Um, this movie also, a complete unknown. I mean, whatever anyone says about it, it moves very fast. I go to a lot of movies, I should say. I mean, I've been to three movies this week and I go in theaters. Um, I mean, it's a 2 hour, 20-minute movie and it sure doesn't feel like it. It's very, the Mangold is a very good craftsman. It's
Yeah.
a fast moving movie. It's carried by the music. I think the performances are uniformly strong. Are there little things that bother me? Yeah, there's some tiny things that bother me. I'm annoyed to hear the Dylan character use the term covers for folk songs. Nobody called folk songs covers until the 80s, and it was an insulting term singer-songwriters use. Dylan wouldn't call someone singing Barbara Allen a cover today. But that's what bothered me,
Right.
not the fact that the scenes they invented, I thought were by and large very effective.
Yeah. The Judas thing didn't bother you.
Oh, that's ridiculous. I mean, the people who were bothered by it.
Right.
I
Yes.
mean, you know,
No, it works. In the film, it works.
it works. And the other, as I posted a thing on Facebook. I mean, people have this weird idea that because they have a tape of someone yelling Judas in Manchester Town Hall and Dylan responding, that was an important moment. All that's unique about that moment is that it got caught on tape. I mean, Dylan was traveling all over the world with people yelling at him and him responding. And that is the one moment on tape of that confrontation. But the confrontation was happening all over the goddamn place. Um, people have weird ideas about what's important.
Can I can I ask you how's the Jelly Roll book doing?
Um, I mean, I wish it were doing better. I think that's, you know, obviously, I think anybody, the books that you've written that everybody knows about, you don't worry about. That's nice.
Right.
The ones you've written that not a lot of people are aware of, you wish more people were aware of. The Jelly Roll book is my most recent book. Um, and we're living in a time where it has become very hard to sell books or to get attention for books. It's done pretty well. Um, but I ask my editor, when do you think we'll go to paperback? And he says, paperback, we don't do that anymore. I'm sad about that.
Yeah.
Um,
Do you think
but
you'll get a bump from the Dylan book?
some, I mean, I should also say the Jelly Roll book, the thing I'm thrilled about is that we've got an audio book by a woman named Mela Lee that I just think is better than yeah, I think the book is better in her voice than
Oh
read off
gosh.
the page. So that I'm thrilled about. I was consulted for the first time ever for auditioning the readers, and I was lucky and got someone I'm very excited about.
Excellent.
But I've had books that sold considerably worse, and I've had books, the Dylan book, and the Robert Johnson book that sold way better. And that's how the game, that's the game. You
Yeah,
keep
for sure.
writing them, and some will attract more attention than others. And the other thing is you never know. I mean, who would have thought that the Van Ronk book would turn into a Coen Brothers movie?
Right. Right. Can I ask you what you're working on now?
Yeah, sure. I'm finishing up a short history of rock and roll for the Oxford University Press very short introduction series. I'm deep in an offshoot of the Jelly Roll Morton book. I ran across a woman he talks about as the most gifted pickpocket in New Orleans back in the first decade of the 20th century, a woman named Ready Money. And as I was researching her, I've got about a page about her in the Jelly Roll Morton book. But by now I've got enough that I've got a 120 pages or so. I'm doing a
Oh,
full scale biography of
wow.
Ready Money, who was a sex worker and black sex worker and pickpocket born around 1870, who ended up owning the largest black owned hotel in Southern California with a staff of 60 people and a nightclub with people like Duke
Wow.
Ellington. So that's what I'm currently working on. Um,
Well, I want to encourage our listeners to pick up Dylan Goes Electric very right away, particularly if you've seen the movie. It's such a delight, Elijah. And I remember actually reading it when it first came out. I read it again this week, and I was saying to myself, I bet I dog-eared the same pages because I found so much worth knowing, and I found the writing to be really just so clear and so ingenious. Thank you so much for
Thank you.
joining us on Writers at Work. It's been a delight.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Okay, you take care.
You too.
Writers at Work is a production of Bliss Publications. Erin Mitchell is our producer. Music is by Joni Mitchell, performed by Keith Jarrett. For more, see writersatworkpodcast.com. I'm your host, Jim Fuseli. Until next time, happy reading.